Good morning, everyone, and thank you for coming to the Boxscore Rebooted panel. My name is Mike Wohl, and I'm a first-year MBA student at MIT Sloan. The structure of this conversation will be 60 minutes, and the last 15 will be dedicated for question and answers from all of you. Please text your questions to 37048 and start your text with ask2, and we'll get through those at the end of the conference. And without further ado, I'd like to present to you our prestigious panelists. We have John Thorne from Major League Baseball, John DeWan from Baseball Info Solutions, Dean Oliver from ESPN, Bill James from the Boston Red Sox, and our moderator for this panel is John Walsh from ESPN, and it's ready for you to kick it off, John.
Here we go. Before we start, I've been saying this for 2 days, and I just received confirmation here from my panelists. I want to give a shout out to Joe Martin for the wonderful music between all these sessions. All right, we have up here a most accomplished set of gentlemen who have spent a lifetime entertaining us, making us smarter, and making us enjoy sports better. We have basically literary sportsies, thought leaders, sabermetric savants, wildly successful businessmen, well-known historians, all superstars in their own right. This is called Reboot the Box Score, but what really we're going to talk about for the next hour is stats that work and stats that don't work and need to be fixed. And the format is our patron saint here, Mr. James, will begin with a preamble to set us up for our discussion. Bill?
Thanks, John. This panel grew out of a conversation I was having with Daryl Morey at an event organized by John about 6 months ago. And my 2 points to start here are, number one, an unloaded gun always loses a gun battle. And number two, there's a great power in consensus. There are certain things in the way that scoring of games is done that just don't make any sense. It happens about 60 times a year, thanks, John, that a reliever will come into a game, surrender the lead, and then be credited with the win because he gave up the lead. I distributed to the other panel members a box score from a game on August 1st in which the Florida pitcher pitched 7 innings, giving up 1 run. The expletive-related reliever gave up 3 runs to tie the score at 4-4, and then became the winning pitcher when his team scored in the top of the 9th. It's not arguable whether this makes sense or not. You know, there's no argument that that makes any sense. There's no position from which it makes any sense. It's just ridiculous. Well, I have known that for a long time. I've known that since I was 12 years old, that didn't make any sense, as most of you have. I've also known since I was in my mid-20s that Major League Baseball was never going to fix it, right? But there is something that's changed, and it just occurred to me within the last few months that it has changed, and that is this. That we're grown-ups now. Look at how many people are here. If you think about Baseball Info Solutions, which is John DeWan's company, and Stats, and RetroSheet, and Baseball Reference, and the many other Fangraphs, almost all of these companies and businesses are run by good people, forward-looking people, and who are, on one level or another, friends of ours. If we get together and decide that we are going to score the games in a more rational way, and we are going to publish the results from a more rational scoring system, there's a great power in that. And the reason there's a great power in that is that an empty gun always loses a gun battle. There's going to come a time within a year or two, the example I used was what's called a BS win, a blown save win. But there's also, the way we score earned runs doesn't really make a lot of sense. if a starting pitcher leaves a runner on first base with 2 out and the pitcher coming up, his chance of scoring is, what, 5% or something. But if the pitcher gives up a home run, that run becomes the responsibility of the guy who was 95% out of the inning. I'm not talking about stuff that's arguably right or arguably wrong. I'm just talking about making rational adjustments to stuff that is obviously wrong. If we create an alternative scoring system in which, on a more rational basis, and we publish that data, there's going to be a time within a couple of years when the Cy Young winner would be different if the scoring system were better, or a pitcher is going to go into an arbitration case with 19 wins when it should be 20, and he's going to use our data as a weapon on his behalf, and there's going to be nothing coming back because an unloaded gun always loses. So that's my real point. If we act together, in the modern world where there is this conference of 2,200 bright young people who, most of whom I think are blogging at this very moment, if we act in concert, there's a great power in that. On the other hand, it is difficult to change scoring practices that have been around for 150 years. I know Dean Oliver has just tried to come up with a better way to evaluate quarterbacks, as I understand it, and within a period of weeks, that's won universal acceptance by the whole. Was that right?
I wouldn't say universal.
Okay, well, you go ahead.
So, yeah, the rolling out of QBR, it's interesting. When you look at a lot of box scores, there are a lot of things that are fairly simple facts, or the definition of a bat is fairly clean, the definition of a hit is fairly clean. There's definitely some gray areas and all these sorts of things. But when you get to something like a win in baseball, or passer rating as it was in the NFL, and now QBR, there is this attempt to really give credit, to really say this is what a guy contributed, to divide credit, how much of the win is really theirs, essentially. And that does take some work to get accepted, without a doubt. I would guess a win would take some acceptance if we tried to assign something like that on an NFL level or in a basketball. It just, you're dividing credit, and no one likes doing that, and it's not clean. When we came out with QBR, one of the concerns that people had, or what we did, is it seems subjective. But I would say a lot of these, a win is subjective. We know errors. We know, some errors and hits. There's gray area between some of these. There is subjectivity in some of these decisions. The idea when you're working with a team, and I took a lot of this into developing the work at ESPN, is that we understand that there's some subjectivity. If there's a dropped catch, sometimes it's right here and the guy drops it. Sometimes, as in the Super Bowl, Wes Welker had to turn around and reach up for it, and he dropped it. Those are different kinds of drops, and inherently one deserves more blame on the receiver than the other. So the analysis that you do is an attempt to account for that. But still, we're still gonna get some of this criticism about it's subjective. And we're trying to take out as much as we can so that it transfers over to where the player might go next.
Can you characterize for us, Dean, the reaction in the football community and the statistical community when we released this, I believe, last July or August?
The community is rather big. I think people that I know on teams were actually quite impressed that we would take something on like that. I know, of course, there's a lot of media out there. There's formal media, there are bloggers. We got, as usual, a flood of comments. The subjectivity concern was certainly there. There was one group of people who criticized us for doing this and then essentially tried to duplicate it a month or two later. That was interesting. I think within, as with anything, I think the second year after it's been around and people are tired of the same criticisms and the fact that there really is nothing better to replace it,
And how different, you had a full season of this to make a judgment. How different were the results compared to the passer rating versus QBR at the end of the season?
For some players, it was different, but when you look at the best players, I think you end up with a lot of correlation. You end up Aaron Rodgers, Drew Brees, these guys end up near the top no matter what. And I would argue, actually, they are in complete correlation with the eye test. You're sitting back there and you're, okay, it's good. It's not a bad thing that those are the same. A lot of times the guys that get moved, the guys that get dealt, the guys you have to pay and have debates about, those are the guys in the middle, and that's where you see more differences.
John Thorne, why does the sports and statistical community have such an emotional upheaval at the mention of something changing or something new?
There's a psychological and emotional basis to our connection to sports. There's a reason why we loved sports when we were kids, and what statistics do, I believe, is to give us the appearance of certainty in an otherwise changing, swirling world. So the idea that we would change the wind or introduce a new statistic rocks our world, and in an unpleasant way. I mean, if you look at the announcement the other day of the additional one-game playoff, the additional wild card, we have a firestorm of criticism. 10 years from now, this is going to be very amusing because it will just be part of the landscape. Many of you will recall a statistic called the game-winning RBI. I don't know how it got into baseball. I do know how it got out of baseball, and that's because everybody made fun of it.
That's right.
So it is not impossible for us to change the way we measure. Certainly, sabermetrics has offered a whole new range of measures which have been slowly adopted by Major League Baseball, or at least countenanced as being in a parallel, bizarro universe that they don't have to deal with very much.
John DeWan, over 30 years in the industry and running businesses, how do you characterize what the community is like today compared to what it was, say, in the late 70s or early 80s relative to these issues?
Well, the short answer is in the late 70s and early 80s, we had to hide in our closets and do our little by-hand calculations and not let anybody know that we're doing them because we enjoyed them, but we didn't think there would be so many who enjoy it. And now, witness this conference and the Sabre Analytics Conference in Arizona, purely on baseball, coming up in middle March. It's just absolutely incredible, the interest in the analytics. And it's just fun to see, you know, like minds, you know, that hey, there's stuff we can learn by analyzing the numbers in sports. And so I used to analyze numbers in insurance, and I got to tell you, analyzing numbers in sports is a heck of a lot more fun. I want to mention something that Bill mentioned. He mentioned, and he said it real quickly, the BS win, the blown save win. And this was something that we were putting together for Bill's book, the Bill James Handbook. And so the column, we're debating what the column head should say. And should it say BS win on it? And yes, we want that double meaning. We want the double meaning in there. So blown save win is just that. The pitcher comes in, the relief pitcher comes in, loses the lead. It's technically a blown save. Then he gets a win after that. 62 times last year, twice per team. And it just doesn't make any sense. You don't give out wins like that. So the idea is, hey, can we figure out how to define a win better? And can we get a group of people together who can set a standard and then publish it? Publish it on ESPN.com, publish it on Fangraphs, publish it on SportsReference.com. All the clients who are clients of Baseball Info Solutions or Stats Inc. get that information. And ERA is another good example Bill talked about in his email that he sent all of us. ERA actually happens to be one of the old-time stats that is really pretty darn good. When you go back, you know, to the stats that we had for the first 100 years of baseball, you had batting average, you had ERA, and you had fielding percentage, and then you had the counting stats. But of all those, ERA was pretty darn good and has stood the test of time. But now, it is not the best stat for pitchers. In fact, my personal stat is the same as, my personal easy stat for evaluating pitchers is the same one as hitters, OPS. What is the OPS of the opposing hitters for pitchers? But ERA has faults too. You know, when a guy comes in and allows, you know, the 3 base runners to score, you know, because he gave up the grand slam homer, you know, 3 of those 4 runs go to the pitcher who bequeathed those base runners. And sure, he has some responsibility, but all of the responsibility for those 3 doesn't seem to make sense. So that's the kind of idea that Bill has been talking to us about and has brought to this panel.
I would add that we can't speak for Baseball Reference or, I mean, we have to try to persuade them to go along with this rather than dragooning them into. So.
I don't know about you guys, but in all the fantasy leagues that I've been in for the last 30 years, and they've been legion, it was never the blown save win. It was always called the vulture win.
The Phil Regan win.
Right. One topic in all of the sports, all the major team sports, is the kind of lack of meaningful or referential defensive statistics. And I know that's a passion of a couple of you fellows up here to be looking into this in various sports. But in all of the sports, I know that they're not used very much, and I'd like to get an assessment from each of you about where we are with defensive statistics and where we might be able to get to. John, you want to start, or?
I can't help but be dying to start.
You go first.
Defensive statistics. You know, you go back 100 years of baseball, we had putouts, assists, and errors and fielding percentage, and that's it. And it tells you something, and it told you more in the old days. I mean, in the old days when they had these ratty old gloves that, you know, were barely better than a handball glove, and you know, they were making errors a lot more often than they do now. The fielding percentage was more meaningful, but even then it wasn't the you know, as good as it could be. But that's all we had, and it tells us, you know, 5 to 10% of what you want to know about a defensive player. And ever since I got involved with project score sheet data back in the mid-'80s, the project that Bill came up with to gather score sheets, and the first thing that I did was study defense. And then got involved with Stats Inc. And the first thing I wanted to do was study defense, and came up with zone ratings. And then involved with my new company, Baseball Info Solutions, and we were tracking, you know, the exact location of every batted ball, and, you know, the type of batted ball, fly balls and ground balls and liners and fliners. You know, a fliner is halfway between a liner and a fly ball. And we found that measuring those things was significant, that you could tell things about fielders by measuring how effective they were at handling different types of batted balls. And we could tell you that, you know, a ground ball hit 15 feet to the right of a shortstop is fielded only 28% of the time, and if it's hit slowly, and that a shortstop who does it more than, what did I say, 15%? It does it more than 15% of the time is making a good play. And, you know, so we were able to start to measure that, and we came up with our run saved system, defensive run saved, and we feel like we're measuring something now that is of significance, that's telling you just about as much as you're learning when you're telling me, you know, when you say that a hitter has a, you know, 942 OPS and he has 107 runs created. You know, when I tell you that a defender has saved, you know, 16 runs at his position relative to an average of 0, it's telling you some significant information. So thank you for giving me the soft lob that I could try to, you know, maybe induce a fielder to flub it.
If I could jump in with one thing, this also relates to defensive statistics. No, I guess it doesn't. Never mind. Dean mentioned the problem with the concept of a dropped catch. The suggesting that a dropped catch is now an old statistic. I actually remember when John invented the dropped catch. You remember?
Oh, in football?
In football.
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember that.
Really?
This was like 25 years ago.
Yeah,
It's been a
in
while.
stats, we started tracking drops
yeah.
back in like the early 90s or something. And I forget, it was a wide receiver of the Miami Dolphins, a tight end, I forget his name. But ESPN had, went on the air saying, he leads the league in 7 dropped catches. And he called a press conference and said, I can't believe that they are going on the air and saying that I had 7 drop catches. I did not have 7 drop catches. And the ESPN calls us and says, how do you got him for 7 drop catches? He says he doesn't have it. So we went to the video and we looked up all 7 drop catches and we sent ESPN video, and now they had the video that showed every drop catch. And it's like, well, yeah, you did have 7 drop catches. And, you know, so it's a stat that we came up with that has stood the test of time, and it is still being used. And so
These
Was
are-
it actually your idea? Whose idea was it? Do you
it,
remember?
I think it was Ross Shuffleberger.
Okay, Ross is acknowledged.
John Thorne, we're talking about video, and we're in the age of technology. We're here at an MIT conference. What advantages do statistics and scorekeeping and everything have with the use of technology today to determine the accuracy of statistical information?
So much more can be done today than Pete Palmer and I did with the hidden game of baseball back in '84. In order to get a statistical snapshot of baseball history, we had to do computer simulations of all games played between 1901 and 1977. Now, with batted ball locations, with pitch locations, with bat speed, with so much video, I think that the various iterations that Bill went through with runs created, that Pete went through with linear weights, the now standard wins above replacement figure used for batters and pitchers, we are at about the limit of what we can do without going to video. But now we have video capture, and it seems to me that the most interesting area is the one that John Dewan and Bill have pioneered, and that's defense. We have various offensive measures that are 99.5% as good as they can get. In fielding, we're not quite there yet, but we are vastly beyond defensive linear weights and runs saved and the kinds of things we were doing in the 70s. Video is the new frontier, and it may take some of the romance out of the guys who are collecting the index cards and putting them in shoe boxes and making their pencil on paper calculations. But this is the way it is. We are going to have better defensive metrics than before. So instead of simply shouting at each other about what a terrible shortstop Derek Jeter may or may not be, we are on the threshold of having evidence for our assertions. This is a dramatic new time.
Let me add on to that too. The video is huge, and I think it is for defensive purposes, but I think the calculations, though they may not be on a note card, on a computer, I think it is a pretty hard thing. We've talked in this conference about a lot of video data that's coming out, especially on the basketball side, but I know it exists on soccer. There's obviously all the work in baseball, and it's an immense amount of data, but you got to know what to do with it. But it is the way to get the insight on the defense, and John was talking about defensive statistics. I think one of the difficulty with defensive statistics is that they don't necessarily transfer. Certainly, you can have the same personnel and a different system will affect the individual statistics and, of course, the total team. So I think the ability of video to reconcile this and basically put together algorithms, computer algorithms, for how to put guys together, too. You take that video, you put it into a computer program, and then you can combine it. And then somehow you got to convince your coach this makes sense.
That's always the key, right? That's
Yes.
always the trick. Convincing, well, for a lot of us, it's convincing the public, you know, sharing information in a way that makes it understandable and makes it readable. And it's the thing that Bill really pioneered. Bill didn't just give you statistics. Bill wrote about it in a way that made you want to read and made you want to understand it. And you were able to follow how he got there. And that's what kind of launched the interest that we all have, and is he made it fun to read. And you know, so that's our role.
You have to tell that story, because I tell people when I was working with the Nuggets and the Sonics, 40% of my time at least was just translating between what the words people were saying and into some number that I could do a study on, and going backwards. This is not math, this is not statistics, it's figuring out how to communicate what's here on paper to people who speak coach language.
Well, I want to go a little further there. You were in the NBA in the halls where these statistics were being attempted to translate. We're just talking about video. When will we see the day where we will always need the artistry and literary weight that Bill James has, but we have video. Can we possibly translate these concepts into video to make them understandable and informative for a public or even a profession?
That's your profession and not mine, and I wouldn't tell you how to do it. I will jump in with I've done no basketball analysis that's worth printing, but the most interesting thing I ever did in basketball, the Kansas Jayhawks, when they lose a big basketball game, I become obsessive about it, and I watch it over and over. So one time I was repeatedly watching, and KU lost the title game to Maryland in, I think it was 2003. In the NCAA. And KU's guard later with the Chicago Bulls was Kirk Heinrich, was the point guard, and Maryland's was, he spent most of the game guarding a Maryland star named, I believe, Juan Dixon. Is that the right name? Mm-hmm. Dixon scored, I think, 23 points in the title game. If you go back and watch the video, as I did several times, what you will discover is that Kirk Heinrich guarded him for 37 minutes in the game, during which he scored, I think, 4 points. But a freshman named Keith Langford, who later became a very good player, but who wasn't quite up to that standard, guarded him for 6 possessions, and he scored 19 points.
Wow.
That
hasn't come out before.
Yeah, I know. It could be 7 possessions, but go back and find the video. You'll find that he just absolutely tore Heinrich apart.
Langford.
I mean, three-pointer after three-pointer, and fouled him on a three-pointer. It was crazy. That was the most interesting thing I ever found on studying basketball video. But to me, it's a question of how do you look. We have these huge piles of statistics now. I know that the people who figure that out and make something out of it are you guys and not me. I'm too damned old, and I'm not that good a programmer. I'm never going to find anything in those. We've got immense piles of data from Pitch FX and Field FX, and they're going to make Shower Cam FX pretty soon, I know. Which, you know, I'll be a big fan. Anyway, but I'm never going to learn anything from studying all that data. It's you guys who are going to learn it. But what you have to do to really get something out of it is reduce it to simple and meaningful groups of concepts, like how many possessions did he guard the guy and what did the guy do? Mm-hmm. You have to reduce it to, you know, it's a large indistinguishable mass of data at this point, and it's going to take you 20 years to carve it up into something that people really get some good out of. But I mean, I wish I was going to be active in the field long enough to do that stuff, but I'm not.
I would say that Bill, I mean, what Bill is talking about is these simple concepts a lot of times come from that 40% of time translating between numbers and words, because if it takes a long time, then you need to come up with this language that is concrete, that is a good concept. When I talk about coach speak, a lot of people in this room would not understand coach speak because they're talking about plays or play types or designs of a set, but it's very useful for them to explain complex concepts. They have a word, they have these phrases, and as these get out, more into the public, I think it will be easier to analyze the data and talk to the fans.
And how much of the data, you've been operating in this, how much of the data can be mined and translated in a way, is it during a season, is it pre-season, and how much of it gets delivered that you see, okay, we're able to implement that and make it a part of what we're doing?
Is that for me?
Yeah.
Okay.
You did it.
I've done a lot of this. Yeah, there are different times of the season where you work on different aspects of the data. Depends upon if you're working for a team, if you're working in the media. There's different gaps that are appropriate for doing different analysis. Of course, there's free agency drafts. There's all sorts of Rule 5 stuff in baseball, and all these different periods lead to different analysis. And when you get this time, when I was working in the NBA, there was this August and September period where you could sit down and work on the projects to simplify everything. That period of time where you have all this data and you need to develop an automatic way to generate a scouting report for an appropriate team. You're putting together not only the programming language, but the concepts that need to come out on paper. And I enjoyed that time because it was a lot more free. We didn't have the responsibility of free agency or draft or signing guys.
But when you did have to present it to the coaches and the assistant coaches and the general manager, and what are the issues and the obstacles in terms of, and the questions that they might ask that kind of formed the basis of the discussion?
The big questions that we always had to deal with from management, they knew generally to ask questions about how much is a guy worth, how much are other players worth that you may be acquiring. And the language, that is a lot of times the language. Or is this so I spent a lot of time with Mark Workentine. We talked about non-fungible players. What is a non-fungible player? Those players being critical in the NBA. And we actually went through this great exercise where he came up with a list subjectively of what are non-fungible players. And you have the obvious ones. You have LeBron and you have Dwight Howard. These guys up here. And then how do we translate that into something that I can use in developing arguments to work with him? So what statistics map all these players into a list that's pretty close to his, so that when I have to talk to him, we're going to draft a non-fungible player by drafting this guy. And hopefully I've mapped them right. And that was a very hard process, but it was a very entertaining process as well. We had certainly arguments about if a guy who averaged a double-double, are they necessarily a non-fungible player? And it's not necessarily true.
So now we're into some of the numbers that you look at. I mentioned earlier, I asked all the panelists to think about the numbers that they think in any of the sports that they're familiar with or most familiar with. What are the numbers, the statistics, the metrics that are the most meaningful for evaluating either individual or team performance? So John Thorne, you want to kick that off here and see where we can go?
I've been given to understand that on-base plus slugging is mathematically illegitimate, but it works. And when you modify it for park factor or chronological period, it is a very elegant shorthand for superior statistics that require more calculation. So I would say among all baseball statistics, that's my favorite. In football, my favorite is another simple one, and it is yards per passing attempt. We can hang tinsel and shiny balls on that one to make it better, but I think it's a basically sound way to look at a quarterback.
John?
So I would agree with John on OPS. I think it's an easy calculation. You add two numbers together, on base and slugging, which commonly you see in various sources, and of course they're showing OPS in a lot of places. So I think it is the simplest concept. You know, there's other concept like Bill's runs created formula is probably one of the best for determining, how much contribution a player has made. But it's kind of a complicated formula. OPS is a little more direct. So I think runs created is probably more accurate, but OPS is very good. And then I already mentioned my favorite stat for pitchers is opponent OPS and defensively, of course, defensive runs saved. But I wanted to mention basketball. Now then I'll turn it over to Dean because that's kind of his bailiwick. But I started looking at plus-minus basketball stats, I don't know, 6, 8 years ago. The plus-minus number, how many, like hockey, how many points are scored when you're on the court and how many are scored against you. And there's a lot of factors that come into play, especially in basketball. But if there's any one stat I'd really want to know, if I want to see one stat in the box score, now, I get my box scores, I'm still, I'm older than most of you here, so I'm still looking at newspapers, getting my box scores in the morning, but they don't have plus minus in the newspaper box score. Now, ESPN has it, and the NBA.com has it, and I don't know who else has it. I know those two sources have it, but that to me, the plus minus numbers in basketball, any one number, that's what I want to see.
So I think it's, as a general category, I think it's interesting. Baseball has been so much a counting stat, and a lot of times a home run champion is most home runs, most RBIs. I think one thing that I tend to go back to is I do like efficiency stats. You guys are talking about OPS. That's an efficiency stat. How efficient are you with what you have? And I think that is hugely important as we're dealing with the other stats. And I'm actually pleased that baseball is doing a lot with efficiency. And in my mind, those guys are the champions. Of course, you have to set some minimum level. But in basketball, the efficiency that matters on the team side is how efficient you are with possessions and how efficient you are on the opposing side, of course. And I would say also even on football, since we've done a lot with football, there's this concept of expected points added. I think that's a very, very useful tool, but I would also use that as on a per play or per drive basis. So it's got to be an efficiency.
Well, I don't like OPS, but that has to do with my being even older than these guys. Sorry, but I guess I'm not older than one of you. You can make great things out of data. Think about this fact. There are 3 people on this panel named John. What are the statistical odds on that? Well, actually, what you can infer from the fact that there are 3 people on this panel named John is that the panel is a lot older than the people in the audience. Think about it. I bet there aren't 3 people named John in the audience. If we ask how many Jasons there are, or how many Mark? Whatever. But from the fact that there are 3 people named John on a 5-person panel, you can infer that it's a panel of older people sharing their wisdom with the younger people. So, I'm sorry, that's kind of off the point.
But entertaining. I want to take what Bill just said and ask each of the panelists to tell us. Now, there's a lot of young people out there looking for wisdom, and there's a lot of wisdom in you 4, what you've done for your work. What do you look at today in terms of media and sources that makes you think there's a place where I can go and I can be kind of statistically challenged or and reinvigorated, or here's somebody that's making me think because they're doing a good job looking at the statistics for Jeremy Lin or whatever the latest rage is, or something that might be more obscure. Where do you go? Where do you go looking for stuff?
The places I go most often are RetroSheet and Baseball Reference, .com. Those are the 2 places I start. And I've stopped reading a daily newspaper for the most part. I mean, I don't check box scores there anymore because they just don't have room to put the plus minus and it's so hard to link from your daily newspaper to what everybody has to say about the game. To me, the internet is a lot more fluid and flexible form in which to follow
For the people out here who may not be familiar with those sites, what do those sites give you, Bill?
The really well-organized, comprehensive data about baseball. My son likes to say that we all have superpowers, but we take them for granted. If you think about somebody in the 19th century being able to cross the country in a day, it would be Superman. We all have amazing information at our fingertips. As my son likes to say, I have all the knowledge in the universe right here, and pulls out his cell phone. It's amazing the world in which we live in. I never get used to it. I grew up, well, my favorite story about it is I was writing the crime book, and I was wondering if whether Henry David Thoreau had ever met a 19th century murderer named Dr. John Webster. So I got on the internet, and in 10 seconds, I found a place in a biography of Henry David Thoreau where it talks about when he was an undergraduate at Harvard, he was suspended for setting off a stink bomb inside a dormitory with chemicals given him by Dr. John Webster. We live in can you imagine how long it would have taken you to find that fact if you didn't have the internet? I mean, I could have done a month's research trying to find whether Dr. Webster knew Henry David Thoreau. Not that I would have, because it wouldn't have been worth it. But
you would have, Bill. You would have. 25 years ago, you would have.
Wow. We are all supermen. We have superpowers because we have the internet at our fingertips. We can look up now in a second what I was thinking about some player and wondering what he hit in 1946 in the minors. You go to Baseball Reference, it's right there. You know, you can look up everybody's minor league stats every year of his career. It makes it possible to do a level of research that just was not possible 25 years ago. And people, like older journalists, like to bitch and moan about citizen journalism and how they're eroding the standards. I mean, the standards of accuracy now are so far above what they were when I was a young writer that I couldn't begin to publish the things that I did 30 years ago, because it is so easy now to check the facts that you just have to check everything, that things that just physically weren't possible to check with the same rapidity when I was a young writer. So we live in an age of miracles, if you ask me.
I was on a panel yesterday, the basketball analytics panel there, and Jeff Van Gundy was talking about he would make up stats to support his point.
Right.
I think his players need to have the ability to look these things up.
That's a training issue.
So one of the big takeaways will be here, the Webster-Thoreau stink bomb connection that we can all walk out of here and regale people with this evening. Dean, you want to tell us about places you go?
So it's funny, I think I'm probably the youngest one on this panel, and actually I like going to books to read certain things. It's the diversity of the things that I read now is, right, I've been reading this legal theory book because it talks about how to divide credit, and one of their examples is this. Lawyers are crazy. Their example is a lawyer goes out into the wilderness, he's going to go camping, and he has some clients who hated him, and one of them goes out there and fills his canteen with sand so that he will eventually die of thirst. And then another person who doesn't know anything about this goes out and just steals the canteen. So the lawyer dies of thirst. Who do you blame? Because division of credit and division of blame is actually a big deal in sports. These are some of the things that I end up reading, and I haven't found that on the internet. But I'll read that. There's actually another book on, you remember where if you have a brother or a sister, if you just have one, and you both want the piece of cake, and how you split the cake so that everybody's happy is one person gets to cut it and the other person gets to choose. Well, apparently there is a way to make this extensible to 3 people, so that if you had 2 brothers and sisters, you could actually make this work. And I haven't gotten to the part where they say how to do it. So these are the kind of things that I end up reading because they do relate to a lot of what we do in sports. On a regular basis, I certainly read the news. I certainly keep my eyes open for anything that my team tells me I should read. I think I spend the whole next year trying to catch up on all the presentations here that I didn't get a chance to see as well.
Dean, how could you see any presentations? You're on the presentation. 4 different ones.
4 different ones.
That's pretty cool. And QBR is coming up next. You guys got to see that, QBR in the ballroom.
Yeah,
There's my plug for you.
Thank you.
50 cents, please.
Take care of it afterwards.
What stats do I look at? Or what sources do I use? I like to pretend I'm young. I use my phone. I get my scores from my phone. You know, everybody does it, right? Oh, what's the score in a Bulls game? Oh, yeah. How many points does Derrick Rose have? So, you know, that's, I use Sportacular, whatever that is. I'm not sure that's the best one. If you know a better one, let me know. And then, like, just to give you an example, preparing for today, I told John I did like 10 or 15 minutes of research, and I used 3 sources. I used Bill's book, the handbook, to look up stuff on blown saves, because I knew we were going to talk about that. I went to sportsreference.com and got information from there, and Fangraphs. And Fangraphs is really like a revolutionary site that gives you all these all the newfangled stats. And I know all of you, you know, most of you know about it who are baseball people, and so it's a good site. And then during the season, ESPN.com really does a great job. So I'm always getting into ESPN.com during the year.
For me, it is like as with Bill, retrosheet.org and baseballreference.com. But where I spend most of my time, because as a historian I'm more interested in what happened way back than what might happen tomorrow, is in reading old newspapers. And while we think of the internet as making us all supermen in terms of access to current information, it is also the great handmaiden to baseball history. So that when I wrote Baseball in the Garden of Eden, it took me 28 years from the beginning of the research project to publication. And I would say the work I did in the last 5 years was worth far more than the work I did in the first 2 decades. Because all of a sudden I could read sources without having to get on a plane or a bus and deal with obstinate librarians. And it is completely miraculous that you can have a question occur to you over coffee in your pajamas, and before your shower you have gotten to the bottom of things by checking 3 or 4 antique sources that would never have come across your path.
Okay, we're going to wrap it up here with some questions from the audience. Bill James, what is your proposed solution for the blown save situation statistic?
The power of consensus depends upon our agreeing to that together rather than my trying to dictate a solution. So my idea is that several of us can, those of us who run the information sources that are used by most of the public, can get together and agree upon a definition, and it's not really important what my solution would be any more than it is anybody else's. Basically, I'm willing to go along with whatever people do. I just want to get rid of the stupid rule that we have now.
Connected to that is a question: should quality starts be a component for consideration in that discussion?
No, and thank you for asking that, because what we can't do is start getting carried away with, while we're fixing stuff, let's fix this too, and let's fix this too, and let's fix this too. Because if we do that, we will lose consensus. And the power is in the consensus. Therefore, we have to limit what we try to do to a few objectives so that hopefully we can all agree.
John Thorne, is Major League Baseball open to changing statistics?
The good thing about Major League Baseball is that it's slow to change. The bad thing is that it's slow to change. We have to be careful, all of us, not to go so far in the direction of, say, the game-winning RBI, that we have no place to go once informed opinion hits that stat. Major League Baseball and the Elias Sports Bureau form a formidable tandem for evaluating change and evaluating changes to the historical record, but I doubt that they will be quick to implement the kinds of changes that we're talking about today, for the blown save win, for example. However, all change comes from the outside in. So it is the people in this audience, it is the readers of this panel's books that are going to mount the campaign, if there is one, which ought to be an informed and deliberate one. I think MLB is not unresponsive to change, it is merely slow to change.
Dean Oliver, similar to wins and ERA in baseball, assists or turnovers in basketball are subjective and sometimes assign imperfect blame. Should they be reevaluated?
I think they will. Turnovers are a little bit cleaner. Assists are pretty dirty. I remember something that Bill wrote a long time ago about statistics, evaluating on how clear they are, how reproducible to some degree, and then how valuable, how well do they represent what's going on. And I think an assist is an important thing to capture. You want to get some idea for how other people helped set up a basket, but they're so subjective. They're so, I know the NBA is very liberal in handing them out, and other leagues are not. So I think the Dirk Nowitzki game where he was nearly perfect from the field, I think he made 15, it was like 15 of 17 or 13 of 15, and a lot of those seemed to me to be isolations on the wing, but he ended up being assisted on most of those by the
Dean, is
official
there
record.
a rule for the assist? Is there like,
There's a
you
rule.
can take 4 steps after you get the pass and it's an assist, but not 5?
No, it's not that hard.
there-
No, it is a pass directly leading to a basket, which that is vague enough that it's pretty open, and it makes it difficult to use the data. You want to use it because it gets at something important, but it's so subjective that it's difficult. I think on the other end, we have this plus-minus statistic that shows up in the box score. Right now, it is very clearly defined. It's unambiguous. You know what it is. It's how well the team does when you're on the court, but how well does it reflect on the individual's contribution is very vague.
Okay, this is leading right into the next question for John Dewan. On the gambling panel, basketball plus-minus was discussed as a potential misleading statistic because of the nature of substitutions in the NBA where LeBron may sit down and due to a random set of circumstances, somebody may be in and may not be the person who is responsible for whatever the plus or minus is at that time.
It is. Every statistic is misleading. Every statistic. Taken in different context, every statistic has a flaw. But what you're trying to do is assemble statistics that have some meaning and have the best meaning. You know, if someone scores 28 points in a losing effort, and he does that consistently in a losing effort, is that more meaningful than the fact that he had his plus minus is -6, you know, and then it's -8, and then it's -4, and he's scoring points, but he's consistently has a negative. There are outside influences on plus minus. Yeah, if you're always playing with your starting unit, your plus minus generally should look better than your backup unit, unless your backup unit is better than the other backup unit. Then you could have really good plus minuses because you're with it's all dependent upon the unit. But in the end, I think it is more meaningful than all the traditional basketball stats, even though it has flaws. So,
yeah, I know coaches like to use it because it is unambiguous. Oh yeah, we played really well with him out there, but yeah, it doesn't reflect easily upon an individual because there are so many other factors that
there's
are out
a ton
there.
of factors.
It's difficult.
Final question for everybody on the panel. What are the strengths and weaknesses of the wins above replacement WAR statistic?
Love the question. I'll go first on this one.
Pardon?
I think that actually at some point you need a panel that is to talk about what is replacement level, because I think you can define it so many different ways, and I think I could talk about replacement level for a long time. So that's my contribution to this answer.
That's a real. I can't improve on that. The difficulty of it is that we have a hard time knowing what is replacement level. That's the real problem.
So my co-author, The Fielding by Ben Jedlovic over there, came up with a technique to come up with replacement level. And he said, I'm going to take the worst player at every position in each year, and to me, that's replacement level. So, but that was his definition, and there's other definitions out, and I think you're right. You probably need a panel that is going to say, this is the one definition we're going to use, and we're going to go and use that.
I think there inherently should be multiple definitions.
But having said that, wins above replacement is a very good stat.
I agree.
And even if we do use different definitions of what the replacement level is, it is one of the best stats out there in baseball. So, you know, every stat has a flaw. And if you understand the flaws and you use the stat in the right context, you're learning things.
So John Thorne, final word, where will WAR fit in the history of baseball?
Wins above replacement seems to me to be very, very much the same stat that Pete Palmer developed 30 years ago, in which the floor was not replacement level but league average. And the objection to that was that you had a player like Lloyd Wainer who played 22 years in the big leagues, and his career mark was below average. Yet if he's going to last 22 years, he must have been thought to be a superior player. He held his job somehow. So replacement level as a replacement for mathematically calculated league average, I think, has put us down the rabbit hole.
All right, it's been informative, entertaining, and enlightening, and join me in thanking all of our guests.